Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Captain Bill Bray, who served for almost 30 years in the United States Navy. He is now Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Proceedings Magazine at the U.S. Naval Institute in Annapolis, Maryland. Bill Bray, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Bill, will cover your recent article entitled "The Navy Information Warfare Community's Road to Serfdom," and we will have a link to this in the show notes for those who want to check it out. But before we get into this topic, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape?
Our strategic landscape, by meaning, I guess, what's going on in the world. So I spent a lot of time in Europe, and obviously I paid close attention to what's going on today in Russia, Ukraine. And I think the larger issue is that democracy has been under a lot of pressure globally in the past, really past couple of decades, both internally and in some cases externally. Everyone gets that now, I think. They understands it, and there's a lot of worry about where it's going. I'm fairly optimistic that it's going to come out of this stronger, as democracy, liberal democracy, has in the past. But it's not something we can take for granted, and it could scarily involve conflict. Hopefully, we can avoid that. But that's really the story, both at home and abroad.
Yeah. My introduction for you at the top just a moment ago didn't do your career justice. Could you give our audience just a little bit more background about yourself?
Sure. I graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1988. I was a surface warfare officer in the Navy for non-Navy people, ship driver, colloquially called. For 4 years, I laterally transferred to naval intelligence in 1992 and spent the remainder of my career as an intelligence officer. I served in various assignments, mostly what we call kind of mainstream analytical assignments, doing analysis, managing analysts at both the theater level and national agency level. And then in between those tours, you do fleet tours. The other service might call tactical tours. So I went back and forth. I lived in many places, overseas twice, moved 11 times in 25 years in that career, and retired as a captain. My two principal jobs as a captain were a command of the Office of Naval Intelligence Nimitz Operational Intelligence Center, which is a 500-person command in Suitland, Maryland, and the head of intelligence for U.S. Sixth Fleet Naval Forces Europe Africa in Naples, Italy.
Wow. Yeah. What a career that was. And you retired in 2016. Is that correct?
Yes. 2016, and I took this as a job in 2018.
Got it. So, as we mentioned, you just wrote an article, "The Navy Information Warfare Community's Road to Serfdom." Why did you write this article?
Yes. Okay. So to answer directly that question, a couple of things happened this year that made me think I should write on this again. I really had written on this problem a few times in the past, but many years had gone by and I hadn't commented on it, at least publicly. So one of them is the Navy has been really struggling with cyber warfare. Now, I'm not a cyber specialist. I haven't worked in that line of work. I've worked with cyber people. In fact, I have some experience when I was in command at Nimitz of standing up a cyber warfare center. But I'm not technically skilled in that. And long story short, the Navy, the Congress has become very dissatisfied with the Navy's effort in the cyber realm, to the point where they decided they're going to roll their sleeves up and get involved and tell the Navy how to fix the problem. That's never good when the legislative branch of government is telling you how to do things and potentially withholding money, and if you don't do it. So I thought, okay, how did we get here? How did the Navy's information warfare community, which was started in 2008, wind up in a place today in 2022 where this is happening? I do have some confidants that are very plugged into that process, both on the Hill and elsewhere, and that would fill me in on some of the details. I don't want to use their names, but so that was one thing. The second thing is the US-10 fleet, which is the fleet that was actually has a long history. It existed in the Second World War. It was deactivated and was reactivated in the late 2000s to be the Navy's cyber, essentially their cyber command. It's the Navy component of US Cyber Command. That's one of its hats. So Fleet Cyber Command, FCC, and it's a 10 fleet, which is an operational fleet. In other words, it operationally directs cyber forces and information warfare forces around the Navy. The commander of the current commander is an aviator. The previous commander was an aviator. The deputy commander is a submariner. Why is the information warfare operational fleet not commanded by an information warfare officer? It has been in the past, episodically, but it is not now. As I explained in the article, feel that one of the reasons is the Navy doesn't really believe that information warfare is a true warfighting discipline and community on par with their traditional warfighting communities in the Navy. For non-Navy people, going way back, the only warfare community was ships. Then you had submarines. So you have a submarine warfare community. You have naval aviation that came about early 20th century. So those are the big three. You have a smaller, although bigger than it used to be, smaller Navy Special Warfare Community, aka SEALs, and their supporting entities. So that's four. And in 2009, the fifth one was established. It wasn't called a warfare community at first. It was called the Information Dominance Corps. But in 2016, the CNO at the time, Admiral Richardson, changed the name to Information Warfare Community. So there's five. Of those five, only one is routinely commanded and run by someone from another warfare community. This to me is telling, so those are the reasons. Those two reasons are why I said I think that it's time for to write another essay on where we are in the state of play.
Two things come to mind for me as you're describing all that, Bill. First thing is one of my favorite sayings, which has a little bit of truth in it, but it's also kind of snarky. But history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and it sounds like the Navy information warfare community might be going through some of the same challenges that, I don't know, maybe the submarine community went through once upon a time when subs were just coming online. That kind of thing, like growing pains, right? But it's its own unique version of growing pains. It's not identical. It rhymes. That's number one. And number two, I'd like to get your thought on this. So we'll put a link to this in the show notes. But one of the previous guests we had on the program here was retired U.S. Army General John Davis. And from his perspective, from having worked in the Pentagon, whenever there are agencies and players, jockeying around or for position within the military service, more often than not, the squabbles are over pots of money. And do you think that you could trace some of these challenges that you're observing back to pots of money?
Yes, but let me go to your first point first, which is historical analogies. Yes, historically, the Navy and all the services, I'm sure, have had sometimes slow to change, slow to adopt a new thing. Um, these analogies have been employed in defense of the nascent information warfare community in the Navy, to say, look, it's just like aviation. Aviation struggled in the first couple decades of its existence. Naval aviation, it struggled in the sense that it struggled for primacy, or struggled to be really as powerful and relevant as it became. Then World War II happened, particularly the Battle of Coral Sea, and then it was clear to many that the game had changed in naval warfighting from ship on ship engagements within line of sight to aviation engagements from a longer distance. Okay, so that's done. I get that. I don't want to be. I certainly have not tried to be a resistant to change guy just on reflexively without thinking through this. I think that that analogy is flawed when applying to the way the Navy's doing information warfare, and I can explain that in a bit. The second thing is you'd had about money. Yes. So when the original papers were written on this to kind of put this information dominance core, as it was called at the time, even before that it even had that name, it was just an idea. The one of the overriding drivers of this was the information communities needed more power because we were in a very rapidly changing digital information age, and it was affecting all forms of warfare. And so therefore the information heavy type of specialties, I guess, in the Navy needed more power. And the way you get more power is you get bigger. And when you get bigger, you get in our case, a 3-star in charge, a deputy chief of naval operations, which is a more powerful player, has more budget, much more budget, TOA, if you will, and total ownership. And so that was true. And I thought at the time, as I mentioned in the article, I didn't really think that was necessarily a bad idea. What I did think was a bad idea was it was very, very rapidly implemented. And I believe that there wasn't enough, and I don't want to suggest that we should do studies after study after study for 10 years, but that there wasn't a lot of thought into what is information warfare in the Navy, what are the key tasks and disciplines, and what does it accomplish, and then take that and build a community to support that. Instead, it was take the 4 communities: intelligence, meteorology and oceanography, cryptology, and information professional community, put them together, and then we'll figure out that other stuff later. And to me, it was a bit backwards. And so we were kind of had this thing kludged together, and then we were trying to figure out, like, how do we do this? And anyway, so yes, money is always there. Budget and power is always there. So I hope I answered those 2 questions.
Yeah. And you started getting into the maybe the crux of the article, or what I wanted to ask you about next. And so you've been especially critical of some of the manpower choices that the Navy has made. And so could you unpack this a little bit more? What has the Navy done over the last, I don't know, what is it, decade or so, relative to information? What do you think it was that they're trying to achieve? And if you could discuss that, that would be great.
Yeah, well, I don't think that the Navy really knew what it was trying to achieve. It had a vague sort of concept of, information is power, information is more important, and we need to get going and get moving, we're falling behind. It was that impetus, that sort of fear of falling behind this problem that drove a lot of it. But so back to the analogy, and I think I mentioned a similar thing in an email to you, which is, if you took 10 naval officers today, or even back then, 2008-9 timeframe, from various backgrounds in the Navy, aviators, submariners, what have you, and you had them in a room and you said to them, submarine warfare, just those words, submarine warfare. What would pop into their heads is pretty much the same thing. The same image conceptually of what that is. If you say information warfare to them, then or now, I would submit very different things pop into their heads, depending on what their experiences are, their backgrounds. So right from the get-go, information warfare is a very difficult thing to define. I'm not sure it's definable, quite frankly, in that sort of way. And the communities that are put into it why are they information warfare communities instead of, I mean, almost any community, of course, any community uses a lot of information, but so what a meteorology officer does from the time they come into that community, their schooling, they all have to get in that small community, they get master's degrees in that subject. And what they do and what an intelligence officer does and what a cryptologist does are very, very different things. And what an information professional officer does, very, very different. I would say more different than similar. So you have this problem where you're trying to create a cohesive, larger community because you want more power and stake in the future of the Navy, but you're putting four communities together that are very dissimilar, more, in what they actually do. It's not about using information. That's the critical thing about them. It's what they do with it. What meaning do they bring to information? That's the crucial thing. Those are the crucial skills that they bring. And so that is a conceptual, to me, a conceptual flaw that you can't dance around. You can't avoid that. It's going to come back to haunt you, and it has, because we've tried, and I say we collectively, not personally me in most cases, but have tried to find ways to get officers at the kind of the mid-grade to senior level more experience in the different areas, but there's only very little you can really do with that. There's only so much time in an officer's career. And you're risking, which scared many of us from the beginning, you're risking becoming too wide and too thin on the larger, in all these different information disciplines, and that special knowledge and special expertise that makes those four communities so important to the Navy and why they were created in the first place. These communities, well, the two oldest restricted line communities are intelligence and cryptology, were created in the 1950s by the CNO by letter. And I don't go into for your audience, the background of why that was done, how the Navy does promotions and all that, but it was done to protect the specialty. Because after the Second World War, it became clear that that you couldn't dabble in those professions like they did before the Second World War. You had officers who were just general officers, naval officers. They may have commanded ships, they may have done other things in the Navy, and they were sort of intelligence subspecialists. And after the war, it became apparent we need professional communities to do this. And that's really served the Navy very well for many, many decades. And naval officers in the intelligence community and the cryptologic warfare community were superstars in the joint world that did very, very well. And it's because we had that commitment to that specialty, and by putting this thing together, you really started risking that. Now, those that oppose my view would say, well, we can do both. We can still protect that specialty and also do this. I'm not so sure, but why then, if you have this information warfare community, why wouldn't the Navy want information warfare flag officers? And I know still many of them today because they're closer to my peer group. I'm starting getting a little older, but and they are fantastic officers. Okay, we have very strong communities, very competitive, extremely talented officers. And I refuse to believe that they're not as good as their URL counterparts, their unrestricted line traditional warfare counterparts, but they're not always in charge of the information warfare community. And I think it's a signal that the Navy's not really sure what this is. B, not convinced it's really a main battery or main effort or main warfare community like the other 4 communities. It's still an enabling. It's a set of enabling community specialties that helps the regular traditional warfare communities do their business. And it's difficult to define. They want something, they being the senior leader in the Navy, and they can't quite articulate what that is, and they're waiting for the information warfare people to show them what that is, but they don't know quite what it is. And we sort of reflexively go back to our specialties and say, well, this is what intelligence is. And the cyber thing has been so screwed up. Now there's a case where, if you had asked me, 14 years ago, of all the things in this new information warfare community, that what is really what's the most important actual warfare aspect of it, I would say cyber. That makes sense to me. I know what you can do with it offensively. I know what you can do with it. What it's important to defend against. It has real application in the warfare realm. The other stuff, I'm not so sure. You can rhetorically say it's warfare, but cyber, and yet we are in a place today where that's the part we didn't get right. And I would submit because we were too focused on being generalists and didn't want to carve out a part of the Navy to be really deep cyber warfare experts.
All right. Well, you said a lot there.
Yeah.
No, it's good. I'm just going to try to condense it down to what I heard were your key points. So what I heard was, from your perspective, it sounds like the Navy manpower was looking at this as a way to try to have some some kind of like a career progression and a promotion opportunities for people communities that they're grouping together as under a information warfare banner, right? And so they're taking these disparate communities. So that's number one. And you're saying, well, it sounds like, that's not quite working out the way it would have hoped. But on top of that, these communities that are getting bundled together are just not, it's inappropriate to bundle them together. Do I have that about right?
Yes, I think there's no strong conceptual case to put them together. I think they're stronger individually, and if you want to, for instance, Navy has in the Navy we have things called type commanders. Okay, type commanders are man, train, and equip commands that focus on making sure the force is ready to go deploy and be, to go work for the COCOMs. Okay, so the aviation has Naval Air Forces is their type commander, Naval Surface Forces is the surface type commander, etc. The Navy created later, not initially, but later, they created an information forces, information warfare type command, if you will. I still, to this day, don't think that's a particularly bad idea, because the information warfare communities, when they serve afloat, they have certain needs, some obviously MT&E needs that every community does, but they don't own the platforms they're serving on. So it's a struggle sometimes to get your need through the surface warfare type commander or the naval aviation warfare commander. You tend to be a lower priority. So having a 3-star information warfare officer running that, I think can be a good idea. I don't think the 4 communities individually have to be put together to do that. You could simply compete the leaders or senior officers of all 4 communities and then assign one there. So I think that's one thing that's okay. I lost my train of thought there on my second point I was going to make, but go ahead.
Yeah. So that was your last critique then, is that this community has been formed officially, and yet when it comes to leadership roles, senior leadership roles, and what should rightfully be a information warfare officer who has grown up in the community or has lat moved into the community. But when those command opportunities or senior leader opportunities come up, more often than not, it's some kind of a unrestricted warfare officer from the Navy winds up filling those roles.
Right. And
Which must have some kind of a feedback loop back into the information warfare community, right?
oh, it absolutely is. And I've heard, I've gotten really a lot of feedback on this article, more so than I thought I would. But I've got, it's demoralizing. I mean, when you take a young intelligence officer or young cryptologic warfare officer or something, and they look up and the director of, their community is not somebody who grew up in their community, may have, just tangentially had some, they've all been supported by information. These URL officers have been supported by information force in a career. And some of them may have served some out of body, cyber tour or something. There's, that is true, but they haven't grown up in the community. So that it sends a signal. It is that they're to the young information warfare community officers and enlisted, that their work isn't really valued as much by the Navy. Okay, in my old community, intelligence, the director of naval intelligence was a 2-star admiral. Now, going way back to say the 1960s, that was a URL officer, and that is because in the community wasn't established as a separate restricted line community until the 50s. So it took a couple decades to grow officers, real intelligence officers, full-time intelligence officers, to a point where they were senior enough to compete and get those jobs. And in fact, the first one was in 1976, Rear Admiral Harvey, who was the first intelligence designated officer in the Navy that served as the director of naval intelligence. Sadly, we just lost him a couple of weeks ago at age 98. So from 1976 until 2009, actually 2011, the director of naval intelligence was an intelligence officer. But the kludging of the communities together and elevating the information warfare community in 2008 to 2011, what that did is it pulled at the OPNAV level, at the CNO's level, the naval intelligence, the N2, was merged with the N6 in communications. And after 2011, so it's been 11 years since then, only once for 2 years was an intelligence officer serving in that role, because now the director of naval intelligence is actually a small part of that larger portfolio. So I actually don't blame the CNO sometimes for not using an intelligence officer most of the time, because when he looks at that scope of that organization, you'd be probably better served to have somebody coming out of a communications background than a intelligence background. But it's bad for intelligence to see that, because the director of naval intelligence was unlike many of the other OPNAV codes. He or she was not simply a kind of a resource sponsor role, which they did. So they had a budget and they had to do that part of it. They also did real intelligence to support the Chief of Naval Operations and the Secretary of the Navy. There's an intelligence 24-hour intelligence plot watch floor inside the Navy that does real intelligence. They also oversee the Office of Naval Intelligence, which is an intelligence producing machine of 2,000, roughly 2,000 professionals that are producing intelligence for a series of customers, both at the strategic and operational level. And so it's not the same type of role. And what happened here is usually the officer in the N26 role is not an intelligence officer. As I mentioned, it was only 2 of 11 years. And it has been a cryptologist also briefly for a few years. But they've essentially delegate the intelligence portfolio to the Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence, which is a naval intelligence career civilian. And they are fantastic. I know them and I can't say enough about them, but now you've lost an ability to have an intelligence officer go over to, say, the Office of Director of National Intelligence and represent naval intelligence to the Director of National Intelligence, which is really important because about 80% of naval intelligence budget comes from the intelligence community, not from the Navy. Okay, I'm getting into a lot of arcane weeds here, I guess, but how the naval intelligence, but that you hit the point on the head that by not having an intelligence officer in these senior leadership roles, it's I think it's problematic for a lot of reasons, but one of them is because of the programmatics of it, and secondly is because of the leadership signal it sends down the chain of command.
Yeah. Well, all of this, it's complicated. I mean, like these are wicked problems. But talent has come up over and over again on this podcast as a big red blinking light, and this discussion is part of that challenge. So if you were to have an elevator ride with the chief of naval operations or some other influential leader serving in uniform right now in the Navy, what couple of things would you want to suggest to that person?
Yeah, well, the chief of naval operations, as it happens, was here 2 mornings ago for the ceremony that I mentioned to you before we started recording, and he didn't ask my opinion, so I don't think our elevator was broken. Maybe that was the problem, but
right. Well, maybe someone will send this podcast to him. Yeah.
That's right. So I, obviously in an unconstrained, environment, and the fact that we can't get in a time machine and go back to 2008 and stop this and do it differently. I really think this is what I would do. If he asked me, I would say, number one, what is your information warfare, warfighting? What are your competencies in warfighting? And chief among those, I think, is cyber. So you have to get the cyber piece right. You have to, if the Navy is going to invest in fight in cyberspace, it has to have, no kidding, experts that are grown from the time they come in the Navy to senior level in that business. I know enough people in that business now, and I've talked to enough of them, that you cannot be a dilettante in the cyber world. It's a fast-moving, ever-changing environment. And the other services are much more committed to lifers, so to speak, in the cyber thing. We haven't done that. We've tried to have people, I mean, the cryptologic warfare community has sent people in and out of cyber with 5-6 year breaks, and they come back and they're just so far behind. So I would say to the CNO, let's get that right first. What is that? How big it should be? What should it be structured? Where are the billets? And let's build that warfighting community. And I think that you do that by taking, obviously something can't come from nothing. You have to either get more budget and buy more things, or you have to take it out of what your current force structure. And to me, that it would come out of the, partly out of the cryptologic warfare community and partly out of the information professional community. That's how you would find the manpower, the end strength in manpower lingo, to build that community. Then I would say the meteorology and oceanography should go back to being their own small community. They get fine there. They're doing great things for the Navy. They fill the oceanography of the, now lately in the last couple of decades, but they filled the oceanographer of the Navy role. It's a flag position, so that's fine. The intelligence side of it, so whatever stays, whatever cryptologic warfare doesn't go into the cyber warfighting side, should come into the intelligence side in their traditional role, which is SIGINT, signals intelligence. So they and there's intelligence aspects of cyber too that they could do. I don't know how you would slice that up. And then and the intelligence community, the naval intelligence community, I think you could bring the SIGINT side of cryptologic warfare and naval intelligence together and create kind of a bigger naval intelligence cryptologic community, because there were attempts, or at least it was looked at pretty heavily going back a few decades, of why doesn't Navy's intelligence and cryptologic community combine? And we didn't, for a lot of reasons, many of them good. Other services don't do it that way. So that that could be done. As far as the rest of the information professional community, essentially they're digital chief engineers. They're the maintainers. They're the equippers. They keep the networks up and running, and make sure they're secure. They have a huge defensive role to defend against them and prevent them from being hacked. And that's what I do. And I would tell the CNO, I don't know what pay grade runs each of these communities, probably a 2-star. If you want a principal advisor at the 3-star level to advise you on all of these, that's fine, but they should come out of those communities. It should not come, you shouldn't be a parking place for a submarine warfare officer or an aviator that you want to, I don't know, have him or her get some experience in this business, make them more promotable or nominatable to a 4-star position. I don't know. I don't understand it at that level. I've never been there, of all the different calculations that go into senior management, senior flag management. What I do know is the effect is having down on in the different communities, and I fear it's weakening the specialization and strength of the individual communities. In my old community, that was really threat knowledge, right? So that is the comprehensive threat knowledge is what the naval intelligence community brought to the fight, brought to the table. And we talk about operational intelligence, which is very important. And this, for non-Navy people, was a process and art to kind of kludge all the different sources together and be able to give fleet commanders and tactical operators a picture of what's going on afloat. Very, very heavily focused on the Soviet Navy, of course, during the Cold War, and particularly the Soviet submarine force. That skill set, that ability to see the big picture, be able to fuse different sources of information and articulate clearly to a commander is still very important, but it all rests on threat knowledge. These OpIntel gurus of back in the day knew the Soviet Navy inside and out, which was not, it was easier because the Soviet Navy was a global threat. So if you served in the East Coast or the West Coast of the United States, it didn't matter. That was your principal threat that you studied day in, day out, week after week, month after month. You grew up in this environment. So by the time you were 05 and you were advising a 1 or 2-star admiral, you really knew the threat, and he expected you to know it, right? Now we struggle with that now. And now we have, a major threat, and of course, in the Chinese Navy primarily, but also in Russia. So I really would like to see naval intelligence getting back to doing that. I guess people would say, well, we do it, Bill. What are you talking about? But I don't think we do it well enough.
This has been fantastic, Bill. Lots of things for our audience to think about and to discuss with their colleagues. Let's do a quick lightning round, so 15 to 30 seconds per item here, and then we'll wrap up. So lightning round number 1, Ukrainian lessons.
Yeah, there's a lot. And of course, it's still going on. So it's an ongoing thing. I think from an information warfare perspective, and I actually have written on this in the last few years as well, a lot of people are looking at it, particularly for cyber, like what has happened, how effective was it, what difference does it make, that sort of thing. And then more broadly, the information warfare. I mean, we held Vladimir Putin and the Russians in sort of high regard in the information warfare world, that they do it so well, and we're just all, fumbling and far behind. I think really that needs to be looked at very, very hard. I was there in 2013-14 when Ukrainian President Yanukovych was run out of the country, and the Russians took Crimea. It's very interesting, you could say, and I don't go longer than 30 seconds here, but the Ukrainian population was ripe for an information warfare campaign because of their historical, cultural connection to Russia, et cetera, et cetera. And yet the information warfare, to the best of my knowledge, campaign writ large has failed miserably. And, in 2009, Pew Research surveyed Ukrainians on NATO accession. Only 28% of Ukrainians in 2009 were for NATO accession. In 2017, that number was 69%. So if the goal was to change the minds of Ukrainians about NATO accession, Western leading and everything, and all the different tools in the toolbox in information warfare, it's failed. I talked to actually Fiona Hill about this a couple of weeks ago. She was here, and she agreed with that, but she also said that in other places it's succeeding more. So that's very, very important.
Lightning round number 2, tech adoption.
Yeah, so I mean, we live in this, highly information saturated tech world. I think, and that's good. I mostly, I mean, it's not always so good. It has some knockoff bad effects that affects our cognitive, space as well, and the ability to concentrate, focus, and filter out the noise. But I think though about tech adoption is, when we think about it, don't confuse means with ends. And I think one of the problems with the information warfare community, then the Information Dominance Corps stand-up, was there was confusion on means and ends. Information is a means. What is the end? What are you trying to achieve? What meaning are you bringing to it? And that should be your organizing principle, not the means.
Excellent. Lightning round number 3, Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, that's another one that, was kind of a 10-foot tall. The Chinese are taking over the world. What are we doing? And I think now there's a more sober assessment of it right now. It is, in fact, some of our guests the other day at the conference here on China mentioned how it's sort of run out of gas. It hasn't worked very well in Eastern Europe, in other parts of Europe. And some of there's a lot of buyer's remorse out there. Some of these countries that have been, welcoming the Chinese in. But the Chinese, and this is not certainly my area of expertise, the Belt and Road Initiative had at least a couple objectives. One was influence abroad and being able to influence foreign governments. But the other one was to get Chinese, particularly men, work. Because there wasn't enough, internally, domestically, there wasn't enough demand. They couldn't create enough demand, even with all the state involvement in the industries, to get enough work. So BRI allowed them to ship Chinese men abroad to do the work. Because this is not very popular in a lot of these countries that thought their people were going to get a lot of the work. So I think that that's kind of where BRI is now. It's still there. It's moving along. Countries will take what they can get sometimes, but I don't think it's having quite the impact that people thought it would.
Oh, interesting. Last lightning round, number 4, the road to serfdom.
Yeah. Well, some of the listeners, or all of them, or many of them, will know that's a reference to Friedrich von Hayek's book from, I think, around 1941, in the early 40s, on
I think that's right,
economics. Yeah. And the general point of his book was that centralization is bad for economies. That the best markets are distributed and local. People make better decisions when they're not regulated and controlled from a central planning. I mean, it was sort of an antithesis to the whole central planning theme that was popular with socialists and leftists in the middle 19th century forward. So is there an analogy to what happened in the information warfare? I think you can you can see a parallel, because we tried to centralize this information warfare thing, this information environment thing, which is another vague and difficult term to define, information environment, by centralizing it, and you're risking the specialization and the beauty of specializing in these different areas that we had been used to, and it was good for the Navy for so many years.
Yeah. Wrapping up here, Bill, could you suggest a research topic that it may or may not be related to the kinds of things that we were discussing, but a research topic that you think a interested student might want to take a crack at?
Yeah, I think one really critical area that needs still a lot of study, and I've talked to a couple IW kind of academic experts in this area that said, yes, we just don't have good research done on this is the effect of information warfare operations. Clearly, there's a cyber effect, and I had to go back and pull Leonard Mashmeyer and Nadia Kostyuk published a piece about the cyber warfare Russia was employing in Ukraine. And they published this just before the war. So this is pre February of this year. And they looked at it over many years. And their conclusion is it wasn't nearly as effective as thought. But more broadly, beyond cyber, information warfare people, they traffic in very pseudo-scientific language, right? Like, effects and all these things. And when you're studying, say, a kinetic weapon, a laser guided bomb, 500-pound laser guided bomb, you can do real science, right? You have falsifiable propositions. You can test them. What is this bomb going to do against this type of concrete at this thickness and from this distance? So it's clear. You can get a very good sense of what the effect this weapon is going to have. Information warfare doesn't do that. You can't do that. I mean, there aren't good falsifiable propositions in information warfare. They talk science, they talk warfare type language. There's a lot of comparisons, the cyber bullet, the cyber effects, things like that, but you can't really test it, which makes it actually unscientific. And because you can't disprove it, people can just hang their hat on these unprovable assertions and say it's working. Well, no, I don't think it is, but the burden shouldn't be on me to prove that it isn't. The burden should be on you to prove it is. So there's a whole, I think, avenue of good research that people at places like Center for Naval Analysis and other places could do in this department.
Yeah, 100%. I think that is a golden ring that a lot of people have their sights set on right now, for sure. Last thing, Bill, can you suggest a book that our audience might check out if they're interested to learn more about these kinds of things or some other information-related topic?
Well, I will just recommend the book that I referenced in the article, Eric Larson's great book from last year, The Myth of Artificial Intelligence. Eric Larson is a data scientist. He's also has a PhD in I think it's linguistics or logic, some area. He brings two sides of this problem together and explains when he says the myth of artificial intelligence, for those who haven't read the book or read about it, he's talking about general intelligence or this thinking machines that will outthink us, right? Like, so this fear, this sort of dystopian fear that the machines are going to take over the world and, we'll lose control of them. And he really he unpacks that whole thing and says, no, don't worry about it because we're not even close. We don't even have a research line to even get close to that. Every single advance in artificial intelligence is in what he describes as narrow artificial intelligence. It's discrete. And so why is that important for lay people like me and people in the military and everything? Because when you say artificial intelligence, again, language matters. I'm an editor. When people say artificial intelligence, what pops into their minds are very, 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 very different things. And to understand this distinction is critical, I think, for operators and lay people. Larson does I think a fantastic job. It's very well written. It gets a little heavy in a couple of the chapters when he gets into logic and the different types of logic that are employed here. But I think you come away with an appreciation that, I can sleep at night. Westworld is not real. It's not going to happen. And B, when I'm talking to technologists about these sort of things, I have a better appreciation for what we're really talking about. I think a lot of the language that's thrown around in this world is just not clear enough. It's not, and people are really talking past each other. So that is my recommendation for a book.
Excellent suggestions. Bill Bray, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.